Good morning. Welcome to the Winter Buzz Breakfast. My name's Ed Manning. I'm the Executive Director for Leadership Asheville, and we are thrilled that you're with us this morning. We've got a great program scheduled. Some of you I know have joined us for the last two events. This is our third event this winter. We're really looking forward to it. Those of you who are new, welcome. We're glad you're here. Really want to thank the Van Winkle Law Firm for making this happen. These are important conversations for our community, and their support has allowed us to bring these conversations to you. With that, I'd like to invite Lindsay Thompson to come up on stage with me. Lindsay is her practice on commercial real estate, land use, and matters involving property owners associations. She is an attorney with the Van Winkle Law Firm. Lindsay, let me bring you up right now to say a few words of welcome. And she does a lot more than that as well. If you'll turn your camera and microphone on, there she comes. Good morning, Lindsay.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Lindsay Thompson. I've been an attorney at the Van Winkle Law Firm since 2008, and I am in the business practice group. We are a full service law firm, and so we have a wide variety of business attorneys. We have a whole trust and estates practice group, and then we have a variety of litigators that practice in all kinds of different types of matters. We are also big proponents of Leadership Asheville. We've put about 12 of our attorneys through the program, and I think we've provided about 5 scholarships for other people to go through the program. So we think Leadership Asheville is just wonderful, and that, you know, it is such an important function in our community of bringing people together to talk about these important issues. So Ed, thank you so much for letting us be a small part of this series, and I've thoroughly enjoyed all of them, and I'm excited to be here today.
Great, thank you so much. And of course, we're feeling very mutual, so we really appreciate Van Winkle Law Firm and all the support you have given us. So thank you for being here this morning. There you go. Yeah, the Van Winkle Law Firm has been a big supporter of Leadership Asheville, and we are really very thankful for having their support, along with all of the support from our sponsors. I want to just say thanks to them real quickly. Obviously, the Van Winkle Law Firm, but also to our platinum sponsors, Explore Asheville and the North Carolina Arts Council. Both are help contribute to make this event happen this winter. We really appreciate their support. Likewise, our featured sponsors, if you didn't get a chance to at the end of the presentation, I really encourage you to go click on their banners. Several of them have some really cool videos and some more information about their programs and what they're doing. So please check them out. But AV Tech Community College, AVL Technologies, Arby's, Lenoir-Rhyne University, their Equity and Diversity Institute, along with Raoul Real Estate, and the African Americans in Western North Carolina and Southern Appalachia, and the Young Professionals of Asheville, all featured sponsors for us, and we thank you very much for your support and continued support. Likewise, our table sponsors, the Biltmore, Home Trust Bank, 103.3 Asheville FM, and Western Carolina University. Thank you as well for your support. And Leadership Asheville wouldn't exist without our sustaining partners. These folks really contribute to the overall running of Leadership Asheville throughout the year. TD Bank, Waste Pro, and the Van Winkle Law Firm. We're really thankful to have them with us. And we have community sponsors or community partners who really partner with us: Blue Ridge Public Radio, Gray Line Trolleys, and YMCA Blue Ridge Assembly. None of the work we do could happen without all of these folks and all their support. So thank you very much, and thank you for being here. Likewise, this event wouldn't happen if it wasn't for our Buzz planning team. And you can see here Katie Cornell, Susie Chandler, Michael Murphy, KP Whaley, and Lauren Yoder, who have all been instrumental in making this event happen. If you need help in tech support, Michael's up at the tech support table. Please join him up there. Really appreciate all the help they did in putting on this great program. And now I'd ask Katie to join me on the stage. Katie is our co-host and executive director for the Asheville Area Arts Council. And there she is this morning. Good morning, Katie.
Good morning, Ed. Good morning, all.
Yeah, glad you could be here. And I'm going to turn it over to you and let you go from here.
Perfect. Well, before I introduce today's sponsor, just a little bit of housekeeping. On the right side of your screen, you'll see several chat functions. You probably defaulted onto the general chat. If you click the back arrow right next to general chat, that will take you back out to the main chat. You'll see there's 3 tabs across the top, chat, participants, and Q&A. We ask that you not use the general chat today. That is for admin use only. But feel free to chat with your table. You're still seated at your table, even though we're in present mode, or chat with friends during the presentation. We encourage you to add questions in the Q&A or upvote questions that you would like our speaker to answer. Our moderators will be using the Q&A during the discussion portion. I hope you all had a chance to see our first 2 events with Mitch Landrieu and Paul Farber. If not, the videos are available on the Leadership Asheville website and the Asheville Area Arts Council website. This morning, we're moving beyond monuments and looking at the broader role of the arts in creating a thriving community. Now to introduce this morning's speaker. In all her work for nearly 30 years, from various perches, higher education, philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, and government, including being appointed to the National Council for the Arts by President Obama in 2013, Dr. Maria Rosario Jackson has worked towards creating healthy communities where all people, especially historically marginalized communities, can thrive. She's worked with a wide range of arts, community development, social service, and health organizations, and is leading curriculum development in higher education at the intersection of all of these fields. A native of Los Angeles, where she now resides, Dr. Jackson was based in Washington, D.C. for nearly 20 years and continues to work nationally. Since 2017, Dr. Jackson has been a tenured institute professor at the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts at Arizona State University, where she holds an appointment in the Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. She's also director of the Studio for Creativity, Place, and Equitable Communities at Arizona State. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Maria Rosario Jackson.
So good morning, everyone. Greeting you from Los Angeles, where it's 6:11 a.m. and still dark. You may get a peek of the sun coming up as we spend some time together this morning. I'd like to thank Katie, first of all, and Ed for inviting me to share some thoughts with you. And some of what I share with you are things that I've held for decades. And some ideas are still in development. And I'm excited to share these thoughts with you and then hopefully quickly turn this into a conversation. Katie specifically asked me to talk about the intersection of community development, arts, culture, design, and also public health. And for some people that alignment might not be obvious, or it might seem like a strange combination. But in my work, which is focused on comprehensive community change, the alignment is actually really critical. And I think it's something that we've been missing for a long time. And talking with you today and now in this context that we're in, it's hard to start remarks without acknowledging this particular time in history. We are in, I see it as a time of transition in a way. There will always be a pre-COVID and a post-COVID. There will always be a pre-George Floyd and a post-George Floyd. And there will always be a pre-January 6th and a post-January 6th. And we're at a time when I think the moment compels us to do something different, to speak truth, and hopefully to get unstuck and figure out how to get things right. So in this context, I think that understanding the role of arts, culture, and design in how we think of healthy communities, healthy people, and a healthy society, I think it's a really important thing that we've missed for a long time. But in order to understand how arts and culture can matter, I think that we have to put aside some traditional notions of how we think of artists, creativity, and our own role as creative beings. So I want to share some premises that undergird what I think is this critical alignment between community development, health, and the arts. So I'm just going to share a few slides to punctuate some ideas. So the first notion is that creativity is an individual and community capacity, and it's an asset from which to build. So in a lot of instances, particularly in community development, about all kinds of assets that communities might have, whether they be related to the built environment or to the natural environment or to the particular economic base of a place. But we don't often think of creativity and people's ability to be generative, to do what humans do, to make something. We don't think of that as a community capacity or an asset from which to build. And in many communities, particularly historically marginalized communities and often communities of color, the narratives are often more around deficits than they are around assets. And certainly an asset, even in communities that have been historically disinvested and marginalized, an asset that remains is that human creativity. And it's something we need to pay attention to. Second, cultural self-determination is a critical dimension of a just, equitable, and healthy place. And what do I mean by cultural self-determination? I mean the ability to take control of your own narrative and tell your story on your own terms. The ability to make sense of the world on your own terms. And if you look around the world and throughout the ages, in strategies to disempower, one of the first things that is attacked is this notion of cultural self-determination, people's ability to make sense of the world and put forward their own narrative. Another idea is that cultural participation takes place in many venues, and it also takes many forms. So we typically think about artists making something for presentation or consumption. And that's kind of how we think about the cultural sector, right? There are people who make art, there are people who consume art, there are audiences or patrons or what have you. And I would ask you to just look at that paradigm as a small piece of how we understand a much more robust cultural life, where in fact arts and cultural activity is happening all around us, not only in the places that are deemed cultural presenting venues or cultural temples, if you will, but there and in many other kinds of places, in community centers, even in public streets, in people's homes. It really is ubiquitous. It can be everywhere. And the participation is not only about consumption, but it is about making, doing, teaching, critiquing. There's so many different ways of engaging and so many other verbs that we have to think about and conceive of when we're thinking about a robust cultural place where it's thriving and where creativity is palpable everywhere in all dimensions of life. A really important idea is that art process can be as important as, or in some cases even more important than, art product. And sometimes this idea can be difficult to grasp or to embrace because we have been conditioned that art is something that we typically consume. And in the work that I've been involved in, that is about integrating arts and culture into community development, but in some very nuanced and I think significant ways, often the process of citizens, residents, being able to contribute to how their community looks and feels and how it reads for themselves and for outsiders, the process of engaging in that is so critically important because it creates a sense of belonging, a sense of stewardship. It creates social ties and a tighter social fabric. And there's so many, I think, impacts that I think of as preconditions to all kinds of other change and important in and of themselves. But what is the catalyst for these kinds of contributions is not necessarily an art product at the end, although that can be inspirational, but often the process of making something together, of if you think about that as a different form of civic engagement even, that is something that we certainly need to begin to think about and lift up in the community development world. Another thought is that artists and designers have many kinds of relationships with publics and roles within communities. And I say publics very, very intentionally because I want to get us to think beyond the notion of audiences who are just consuming, but publics who can engage in many different ways is what I really want to underscore. And that artists have roles in communities that have to do, I think in some ways that they're most important in helping people to take responsibility for their own creative lives and often for their civic lives. Artists help to inspire new ways of looking at the world and the relationships that they have in communities. And I think in the process of creating better places is something that's understood and tested. And last, arts and cultural activity are intrinsically important, and they can also contribute to other community issues and dynamics. So when I started doing this work a really long time ago, as an urban planner, which is my field, it struck me as somewhat strange that in the arts community back then, there was a lot of discussion about a polarized debate, really about art for art's sake versus arts in service of something else. And what I saw was the power of art in part because it could hold so many meanings simultaneously. It could be important for aesthetic reasons that solely have to do with artistic practice, and it could also, at the same time, hold a lot of meaning for things like human development, youth development, our personal well-being, social fabric. And there are many other kinds of outcomes that can be attributed to the arts. Typically, what the argument in support of the arts has been, it has to do with economic development. And I certainly think that that is important, but there are so many other ways to think about the role of the arts. And it's important that we move in the direction that encompasses that kind of understanding. So a couple more ideas. This notion of what arts and artists can do I'd like to think of as relevant to a framework around reframe, retooling, and repairing. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And last, I want to think about our individual health, our community health, and our civic health. So I'm going to stop sharing slides and try to get back on screen. There we go. So this notion of reframing, retooling, and repairing, I think is really important because it helps us understand the myriad ways in which arts and culture can actually be a critical element of both community development and increasingly public health. So in the public health field, as there is growing interest in environmental determinants of health outcomes. So, what it is about place, for example, that has to do with people's life outcomes and their health. There's beginning to be more and more overlap between the community development field and the public health field. So, for example, in the public health field, there's now a lot of interest in housing and the notion of shelter and how that connects to people's health outcomes. And in terms of understanding how the arts and culture field and artists and people who are engaged in creative practices, how that can contribute to, I think, helping us get unstuck and move beyond ways of thinking about community improvement that have fallen short. I think it's really critical to think about first reframing and the role that artists can help us play in reinterpreting what the issues are. One of the good things that artists do is speak truth to power sometimes, and actually get at the root causes of the social dilemmas that we are up against, whether it's racism or sexism or power arrangements that have kept us in these cycles of oppression that lead to the outcomes that we don't want to see. Artists are really critical in helping us reframe issues, lifting up things to expose root causes, but also helping us understand potential solutions in different ways because they're coming from different perspectives and they're willing to help us unsettle our own orthodoxies about how we understand things and why we think things work the way they do. And I think we need that to get unstuck. So that's the notion of reframing. The notion of retooling is actually connected to that because once you have a different frame on something, you often recognize that you have to work differently and you have to imagine what that new way of working can be. And I think here too, artists have something to contribute in terms of helping us retool, helping us think differently about how we work, how we engage community, how we think about structural change. And the point here is not to put artists or the arts sector out there as the silver bullet, because I don't think that's the case. But I do believe that artists in the cultural sector have been a critically missing element in community development and now by extension also in the health field. So this notion of retooling is about helping us to reimagine how we work. And the last R, which is repair, I think is really critically important. And in the community development field, it's something that we have missed. We have not reckoned with harm and historic harm, and often particularly harm that has been done to cultural root. So for communities that have been disenfranchised and historically marginalized, often one of is on your culture. It's on your sense of self-worth, both individually and collectively. And there is work to be done that I think of as root repair in some ways. And when I think about healthy places where people can thrive, I often ask, where is the work of root repair happening? Where is it that people are able to reclaim culture that has been denigrated or erased? Where is it that people can advance their own way of understanding the world and related aesthetics on their own terms? Where does that kind of cultural and intellectual sovereignty happen? Where is it that we are drawn to, both individually and collectively, think anew about our role in the world? What is possible? What is possible individually? What's possible at the community level? And what is possible societally? What is our civic health? So I ended with that last slide, which had individual health, community health, and civic health. And I invite us to think about, what does well-being and health mean at those different levels? How are we stuck in trying to move towards a more positive and just way of thinking about our existence at those different levels? And how might we work differently? So I'll stop with that question and invite a conversation with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. I love the idea of root repair. That's such a great way to say that. So now I'd like to invite our moderators to the stage. We have with us Dr. Darin Waters, who is a special assistant to the Chancellor at UNCA and executive producer of the Waters Harvey Show. And Aisha Adams is the founder and executive producer of the Asheville View and the Lenoir-Rhyne Equity and Diversity Institute program developer. Darin and Aisha, I'll let you take it from here.
I think my mic is on. Okay. Well, thank you, Katie, for the introduction. And Maria, thank you so much for that presentation. I mean, you packed a lot in just in a short presentation. There was a lot there. Aisha, thank you for being here again to join this conversation. I think that, Maria, if you don't mind, I'd like to begin with something that you kind of ended with here. You talked about individuality and the collective, the individual and the collective. There's a major tension that exists between those two things in American society. How do we, especially in the realm of the arts, how do we deal with the tension that exists between those two? And I hope this question is going to make sense, because it seems that collectively we have to be able to, we have to build some type of consensus, right, around what it is that we're trying to accomplish as a community. Are you seeing ways in your work that we're doing that well in some communities? And I hope that question makes sense, but it just seems to me that there's a major tension that exists there. And so it makes me wonder about guiding principles. Can we have a consensus around a guiding principle for a community as it tries to work towards this kind of collective appreciation of the arts?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There was a lot in there too.
And Maria, I hope it made sense.
It did. Let me start with an observation and maybe pose a question in return. I think that the notion of the individual is a little bit of a myth, right? Because as humans, yes, there is individuality, but it is within context. And with context includes people, and the people that we are connected to, both in the present as well as in the past, and if we're lucky, in the future. So there is this across time, this sense of, in indigenous cultures, which I'm learning more and more about, there's the notion of 7 generations, right? There's 7 generations behind us, 7 generations ahead of us. And I think that in and of itself really messes with the notion of individuality. But beyond that, I mean, we are human social beings that don't live in isolation, despite whatever walls we may try to put around ourselves. We don't live in isolation. And I think what's really important is that through the arts, there is an opportunity to make that tension productive, right? How do we interrogate that tension and make it productive? In terms of your question about whether I'm seeing some communities arrive at useful ways of engaging the arts or having some kind of guiding principle, I think is what you said. What comes to mind when you ask that, Darin, is that I am seeing in some places an acknowledgement that economic development is important, but that it at its best is in service of people reaching their highest potential. And I think that reframing of the North Star being people reaching their highest potential and economic development in service of that is a really critical shift. And it's not something that I think has yet caught on or is in the water, but I am hopeful that it is a direction that we're moving to.
And Aisha, before you jump in, I think that I deeply, deeply appreciate that perspective about the guiding principle being people reaching their highest potential. And I just don't think that up to this point, and hopefully these conversations that we're having here, especially in our Asheville community, will help us really think about that as a guiding principle, because I don't think that we've always done a good job of making the type of investment that's necessary for people to actually have the opportunity to reach their highest potential. So as a guiding principle, I think that, that, in my opinion, just a brilliant response to that question. So I deeply appreciate that.
So I'm hearing some themes in the conversation, this notion of people reaching their highest potential. And I think what caught my eye was in one of the tenets you laid out for us about art today was this idea to not be so focused on outcome all the time, but also to be focused on process. And my question for you is, we have so many wonderful community leaders on the line who are responsible for outcomes and who may want to help individuals reach their true potential. What strategies do you have for leaders who are wanting to move into this direction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Aisha, because one of the things that I see often is, especially now, these wonderful proclamations related to change and what people say they want to do. And those happen in the absence of interrogating accountability mechanisms, right? So if you say you want to do different, then shouldn't we look at the metrics and ways in which we evaluate progress? And we don't do that enough. We'll put out a proclamation, an aspiration, a goal, and rely on the same ways of evaluating progress that may not be aligned with the thing that we say we want to do. So I think unsettling our orthodoxies around what progress looks like is really important. And one of the things that I observe at organizational levels, as much as I observe it at a community and a societal level, is that the changes that we say we want often require undoing, unlearning. And we don't have the systems to help us account for that as progress, right? And it's really hard sometimes for people to fathom that feeling a little unsettled and in chaos might actually be the indicator that you're on the right path. And that's hard, right? Because our performance metrics are around more efficiency. They're about the same machine working well. And if what we're saying is that the machine needs to be altered or changed or dismantled and made new, then why are we sticking to those same metrics? So I just lift that up as a consideration in response to your question.
Yeah, those two really great strategies. The first is interrogating your accountability strategy, and the second is undoing that harm, unlearning those structured, those values that are not in alignment with the mission and vision anymore. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, I would like to go back to, and I think it connects with what you just said in some ways. I'm trying to work that out in my head, the connection. But one thing that stuck out to me in your presentation was that you used this term creative, our role as creative beings. And that to me is just very important, because I feel that as a historian, that certain marginalized groups that have been marginalized in our society, their ability to be creative or to see themselves as creative beings has been somewhat stymied and stifled.
Mm-hmm.
Are we doing a good job at this point in kind of reinvigorating that spirit, that creative spirit, especially in those communities that have been historically marginalized in our country? Are we doing a good job? And I often wonder sometimes, Maria, what impact does our capitalist culture, have? Does it impede that spirit of creativity? You talked about, kind of chaos, not sticking to the same metrics. It occurs to me, or at least it seems to me, that if we allow people more creative space, then it can potentially work against these kind of standards of progress that we have adopted, because it's going to upset that. So I just wonder, are we doing a good job in reinvigorating that sense of spirit, a creative spirit among people that have been marginalized, communities that have been marginalized?
It's such a complicated topic that you've raised, Darin, because on one hand, I would say without question, we have underinvested in and underestimated our communities of color in particular, right? Black communities in particular. We have underinvested and underestimated them, and it is a travesty. On the other hand, the creativity that is in our survival is just awesome. The creativity and ingenuity that is evidence of resilience and strength is something that continues to be evidence of our humanity, in spite of all of the obstacles. So it's complicated, right? On one hand, I would fully agree that there has not been the kind of intention, attention, or investment that is merited. On the other hand, and maybe it's not on the other hand, at the same time, there is such evidence of the genius that is within. And I mean, imagine if that was unleashed. There's a woman who I respect so much in New Orleans, Carol B. Bell, who I've heard say, when we think about how we underinvest in our young people, especially, that's not even just our young people, it's everybody. What are we depriving ourselves of? What kind of genius are we depriving ourselves of? So it's complicated. So on one hand, yes, underinvested, underestimated. On the other hand, oh my God, how awesome.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, I agree. I think that we definitely are. I mean, American society in American culture loves to, in the term appropriating other cultures, and comes to mind as I listen to your response there. But then little is done to recognize where this creative genius has actually come from, and to actually celebrate it in a way that I think would open the door for more people in these marginalized communities to see the value of the arts and getting involved. Because sometimes I feel that we're speaking to the choir. And so I am wanting to find a way to open that door wider, to bring more people into the conversation. And I think that valuing and recognizing and celebrating the creativity that has occurred in these communities in a way that it should be, I think will help work us, point us in that direction. So, so I appreciate the perspective, but I totally agree. We have undervalued and I think under invested in that creative genius.
Let's just stay right there for a minute. I'm always interested in this idea of investment and into communities. And we have a lot of questions around what's happening now. So I guess my question to you is, knowing that we have invested in Black art and community and Brown communities, what strategies do you have for us unlearning those strategies that keep us under investing? And what are you seeing other communities do that is empowering and that would be a good model for, I see our city council here is listening, like where should they go to find good examples and models for moving forward?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I mean, there's some things that come to mind immediately because I've been involved in them. So in Los Angeles, where I am, for the past 4 or 5 years, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative for the county. And the Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative has a number of recommendations. And one of them, which I think is really important, is actually a policy that's been passed. And it has to do with cultural organizations, and not just cultural organizations, but all county agencies actually having responsibility for the cultural inclusion and vitality of the region. So we're figuring out how to operationalize it now, but one of the ways that it is beginning to be manifest is that you have cultural organizations that are required to have a statement and a plan around how they're going to advance diversity and inclusion through their work. So that's something, if you're going to get county resources, that is part of your charge, recognizing the importance of the cultural diversity of the region and advancing that. And it doesn't end with just cultural organizations, it extends to all county agencies. So to me, the notion of how people in housing, in health, in recreation, in these other municipal divisions or departments, if you will, to recognize that they too are stewards of our cultural vitality, and that vitality relies on respecting people's humanity and their origins and their history and their futures, their imagination. If we can figure out how to make that come to life, that's going to be pretty awesome. What would it mean to have a housing department that was truly invested in the cultural vitality of the region? How would our housing look different? How would it feel different? It begins to call into question a lot of things that we don't question. So I'm eager to see how that initiative continues to play out, and I hope that it has teeth, that it is impactful. So that's one example, Aisha, of something that's happening that I'm connected to.
I'm so excited to hear you talk about cultural competency as a policy and a procedure and a practice. I think that's super important that we just want to highlight that from this conversation today. And then this idea that the policy must have teeth and must be operational. So that's what I took from this. And I just wanted to recap that for those who are listening. Thank you so much for that answer. It's really inspiring.
There are a number of questions that are coming in the Q&A, and so because you've raised so many thoughts in my mind, but I want to address some of the questions, and I'm looking at them in no necessary order. I'm going to jump around, Aisha, a little bit here because there's one question here that just really is standing out to me, and it comes from it's from Katie, and I think it's so relevant to where we are as a community now. But she is asking, as our community is currently discussing reparations for the local Black community, what role should or could the arts and culture play in this work?
Well, that notion of repair that I lifted up when I was talking about reframe, retool, and repair, it has everything to do with reparations, right? To me, the notion of reparations has to do with acknowledgement that something or somebody needs to be made whole again. And I think investments that are intended to acknowledge the harm done to attacking a cultural root is part of reparations. That is part of repair. It's part of making whole. I think particularly, if you want to talk about African American communities, we have found ways to do that in spite of. But there should be ways to do that because of. And that's a different framing, right? That is working outside of scarcity. That's what's working with an abundance that we should have access to. And the recognition that the repair has to happen, I think, is also, it's a precondition, right, for moving in that direction of making whole. If you don't realize that something requires attention because it's been harmed, you can't really make it whole, right? So the reckoning with the harm is part of the work. And I think that artists in the arts sector has something to contribute in that, right? So there's that. And I don't want to get stuck though in only that, because I think too often there's a pigeonholing that happens when we think about repair and reparations. And the notion is that it should all be hard and somehow underscore pain. And that alone as a single path continues to be dehumanizing. So the notion of joy and claiming that, and not necessarily having to abide by a narrative of abuse or oppression is also part of reparation. Right? So I think it's really easy to get tunneled or to get, one-tracked into this perpetual narrative of oppression, which has a role, but we also have to recognize that it is re-traumatizing.
Right.
how to acknowledge that the harm and the work that does have to happen in that space, and also have outlets that have to do with joyful imagination that does not involve being shackled to a narrative of oppression, seems to me a really critical part of how we think about reparations and the role of the arts. Does that make sense?
It does, Maria, and because I love that you're using the word whole, because I don't know that American society has been structured enough to have an appreciation of the holistic nature of our existence, right? It just seems that we tend, and again, and I'm not trying to beat up on the capitalist ethos of America, but we tend to think so much more about the bottom line. Okay, is it economically beneficial, and not thinking about the whole person. I have been spending time recently rereading an old text written by Arthur Schlesinger, where he talks about the vital center and, it politically. And what he argues in that book is that we as Americans have tended to turn our political culture and our politics over to plutocrats who don't think about the whole person, about very holistic. So there's something deeply, for me, in listening to your response there's something deeply spiritual about that I hear in that. And I wonder, and I'm, Aisha, if you don't mind here, because Maria raised this point about not getting stuck in just this story of oppression, but seeing, being able to see the joy in as well and celebrate that. Maria, how, as you travel across the country and you're in conversations with people across the country, how well are we even doing there? Because sometimes I do get the sense that we get stuck just in the story of oppression. And I'm wondering, are you finding that seems to be abating a little bit? Or, how are we doing here? And what can we do to try to, move in that direction that you're talking about?
Darin, I had that same question. Can I add just a little piece here? So everything Darin is saying, but my question to you, I know how I feel that we're doing as I'm out as an artist, but my question to you is, what role does government play? What role does Cultural Kitchens play? What roles do the nonprofits play in helping us unlearn this traumatic narrative?
Mm-hmm.
So what are you seeing out there, and then what can we take with us?
So Aisha, you mentioned Cultural Kitchens, so that's my thing. I've been thinking about that, the notion of what I call cultural kitchens as critical to healthy places, and I don't think that there is enough recognition that those kinds of places, and when I say cultural kitchens, I think of these as generative spaces, as spaces where people intentionally come together to deal with the individual, the collective, to reckon with harm and imagination and joy. It's where you come to be fully human, right? And you come to both individually and collectively figure out what is your role in the world, right? So that the notion of cultural kitchens to me is really important as a critical element of healthy places, especially in historically marginalized communities. So I think there's that. I also think that the notion of addressing the whole self that relies on recognizing humanity, and injustice relies on dehumanizing. So I think the kinds of places and amenities that exist to recognize our full humanity is a critical investment in neighborhood. I see that as critical community development. I see it as critical to how we think of public health if we're thinking more expansively about health as a concept and not just in a clinical way, right? If we're thinking about lifestyle and environment. And so I see investments in the kinds of, and I won't even call them amenities because amenities feels like you don't need it. These are things that are essential, right? I think investments in the kind of pillar organizations and access to the kinds of opportunities that advance our humanity is not fluff. It's not extra. It's part of what has been missing, which is why we're stuck. And we keep doing the same thing with the same blind spots. And so for years, a lot of my work has been about trying to integrate this notion of creativity, of full humanity, of expressive culture and imagination and aesthetics into how we think of our well-being. And again, to the question of accountability and evaluation, part of the work ahead is figuring out how to align our mechanisms for accountability with the North Star that we say we want to chase, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of good stuff. It really is. We have a question in the chat for you about, it says, I love art as a medium for people to speak truth to power. How can communities foster development as a practice and encourage it in educational settings as well as the community abroad?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are things that I think are really important, like you guys have heard of STEM to STEAM. Mm-hmm. You know, the encouraging math and sciences is STEM, adding arts to it becomes STEAM. So I think expanding what we see as essential education to be inclusive of arts and design, I think that's really important. But I would say, as we do that, you know, to try to do it in a way that is inclusive and that isn't yet another colonial strategy, right? So how do we do that, recognizing that there are multiple worldviews, and that we will only be enriched if we're able to understand multiple worldviews. And I think the arts is a really critical access point to multiple worldviews. So I think, I mean, there's certainly systemic things that have to happen, whether it's in the education system or in other ways. But lifting it up as something that isn't just extra, but essential, I think is part of the work of political will.
Yeah, you ended that with saying work of political will. I have to ask, you know, are you encouraged by what you're seeing? Are you seeing evidence that the political will does exist in some places? And here, Marie, I have to think, you know, I go back to the 1980s and what did Tip O'Neill say, that all politics is local. But we have a tendency to really look now to kind of look to the national picture, and we forget what is going on the ground in individual communities. And I think that there's a lot of exciting things and good things that are happening on the ground in individual communities, but you don't hear reports about it. So I'm wondering, am I wrong there, or do you see the same thing? Are you finding in some of the communities that you engage with and you talk to that there is political will to actually make some of these things happen?
I think that there is. I mean, certainly I was encouraged in LA with this cultural equity and inclusion work, right? So that was something that passed with the county board of supervisors, in a county that's as big as many states in the nation. So it's significant. And if we can make it real, beyond it just being a policy on the books, that's going to be really important. And that's local. It's big, but it's local. So I do think, and I don't want to point only to that example, because I think that there are things that happen with a small p political will at much smaller scales, right? I think even at the family level, we make policy at the family level. When people are sitting around the kitchen table trying to allocate money and time, we're making policy. So even at that level, there is an opportunity to choose full humanity.
Hey, Maria, I have to appreciate you saying that. You're hitting on so many different things that I think is important, because I often hear so many people who just, I hate politics. But politics is involved in everything. I mean, and I thought about that just recently as what you were saying, that the politics, family politics, and what happens there, because it's about who has resources and control of resources, how they're allocated. And we make those decisions every day. And I would hope that if people could think about politics in that terms, then maybe this saying that we've often heard, that politics should be seen as the art of the possible, can actually be actualized in a way that is much more healthy than it seems that it has been. So thank you for that response. I appreciate that.
So my question to you, I think we would be remiss if we didn't take an opportunity to ask, what role does the artist play in this movement, and how do they support themselves, and what resources do you have for them as they strive to be their best self and deliver this truth in art, and to be a part of this process?
Mm-hmm. Now, I think that artists are critically important to change, right? And to be fair, we've done such a poor job of recognizing the range of ways in which someone can exercise a career as an artist, right? So the idea is, it's so it's so stereotyped, right? You're either the star, the Hollywood, Broadway, or whatever star, or you're the starving, hermit that is, and there's no appreciation of the really important range and robust ways in which people who have chosen to dedicate their careers or purpose as artists to assert in the realms where they can make contributions. So one of the things I'm really interested in is, and most of my work is really looking at the role that artists can play outside of the cultural sector, the quote unquote cultural sector. And by extension, one imagines that if you embrace artists working and contributing in all kinds of ways, in the health sector, in community development, and these other places where you don't expect to see them, by extension, that expands the cultural sector. For me, the cultural sector is so much bigger than just the entities that call themselves arts entities, either as funders or as presenters or whatever. It's so much larger and more nuanced than that. And I don't think we figured out how to embrace that conceptually or operationally yet. But the role of the artist, I think, is maximized when we do. You know, when it becomes, and that's part of the work that I do at the university level is, you know, trying to figure out not only how do you advance training for artists that allows them to deliver their gifts, if you will, in these non-traditional contexts, but how do you create the demand for that, right? How do you train social workers so that they know to look to artists as allies in the work that they're trying to do? Or how do you train community developers to know that, again, an artist is supposed to be part of the team. And if the artist isn't part of the team, we're missing something.
Oh,
That's the problem.
it's like looking at artists as subject matter experts, as professionals, reframing how we value art in the workspace, in the workplace, as not just a picture on the wall, but like as an active skill set that can be used to solve problems and challenges. Is that kind of what I hear you saying?
Yeah. Yes. And sometimes sometimes the thinking it gets a little out there, which is good. Right. So there's I remember I'm trying to remember what city it was, but I was in some charrette, and it was a university, and they were trying to figure out how they were going to be good citizens and help achieve some of the community goals. And in this particular neighborhood, one of the things that they were interested in was addressing the fact that it was a food desert, right? So there wasn't access to fresh, affordable food. It was, there's mostly liquor stores or convenience stores or that kind of thing, which is very common, right? Very common. And people in this particular neighborhood wanted a grocery store. And the dilemma that the university administrator was putting forward was, well, we're trying to give them art and they want a grocery store. And they were seeing that as dissonant. And I thought, well, why can't that merge? Why could we not have an artful grocery store? Why can't we upset our thinking enough to imagine that, wow, maybe we can have an artful grocery store. What would that look like? Would that help us reimagine how it is that we're supposed to nourish ourselves? What could that do? If we unleashed our imagination and thought about how could we reimagine a grocery store that also feeds your soul, that feeds your sense of your urge to be creative? Why can't we do that? Why does that have to be dissonant?
Marie, I agree with you so much. And I'm going to make an observation. There's some really good comments that are coming in here. And I want to give you a chance to respond to some of those, but just an observation of what you were saying. Aesthetics to me is very important. The spaces that we occupy are very important. And I think, my two sons are now grown, but I was just recently back in Raleigh, where I lived for 20 some years. And I was just recently there driving up a familiar street. There was this new building that was not there in that particular neighborhood when I lived there. And I asked my friend who I was with, what is that? And she said it was a school. And it looked like a prison to me. And I'm thinking, what does that do? It doesn't seem to me that we're even imaginative about the spaces where we're educating our kids, what those spaces look like, because we want to think so much about efficiency, and we're trying to have, spend as little money as possible, even in the creative, in these spaces that we are building for educational purposes. And I think that works to kill creative spirit. That's just my observation on that. And I don't know.
It's also bad economics, because if you take a look at what it ultimately costs, what the consequences of that kind of dehumanization ultimately costs, that's not good policy development. It's not good. It's not. I mean, it's thinking about efficiency in a very narrow, short-term way, right?
Are people thinking differently about that, Maria? Are you finding people thinking differently about that? Because what you said, it's bad economics. It makes me think about my grandfather used to say that many people cannot see beyond the tip of their own nose. And so we can't see you connected. You did something earlier in your comments that I deeply appreciated as a historian. And I have often quoted people like Edmund Burke, who said that the world belongs to the living, the dead, and those yet to come, that there's this great historical continuity that we participate in. And I think that as Americans, and there have been a number of people who have addressed this, and I'm trying to avoid mentioning a name here that people generally expect me to mention, but we have argued, and the argument has been made that Americans tend to be ahistorical people, that we only think about the present moment, right? The economic, that we don't think enough about the past, and we don't think that much. We'll use the past when it works to our advantage to use it for some reason, but we don't think that much about the future. And I'm hoping that your message and your work is at least leading us to a place where we will begin to think about that differently. Aisha, if I can, just a couple of comments that have come in here. I want to give you an opportunity because one has asked about the work that you're doing, that you're currently doing with Johns Hopkins University. And I want to give you a chance to respond to that question. Can you talk a little bit more about that work? And there was one comment that came in here that I thought was really interesting. And it's from Mary. I can't see the last name, but she said that it's not a question, but it's a comment. And you might want to respond to this, Maria. It says, I hear Dr. Jackson telling us that we are all artists of our own lives, and that we live and that we need to live into that. So, and I hear you saying that too. And, but can you tell us a little bit about the work at Johns Hopkins? And if you want to respond to Mary's comment there, by all means, please feel free to do that.
Yeah, so the connection to Johns Hopkins is actually a little broader than that. So there was an initiative out of an organization called Art Place America, which just was a 10-year initiative, just sunsetted. Part of what they did was policy scans related to 10 sectors, and health was one of them. And they were looking at what is the role of arts and culture in these different sectors. And in the scan that they did related to health, this was something that actually was done with the University of Florida, where they brought together a group of people that included folks from Johns Hopkins but other organizations and higher ed and other as well. And I think, in collectively, including Johns Hopkins, but also University of Florida, there's a lot of interest, as I said before, in what is the role of the arts at the intersection of community development and health. So some of the work that has focused on arts and health in the past has been very scientific and focused almost clinically, right, on arts therapy and on really important studies that have to do with neuroplasty and what happens to your brain when you get in creative flow. There's actually some really important work that the National Endowment for the Arts is funding with, and we're doing with Department of Defense, with soldiers, military who have returned and have brain injury. And they're looking at the role of creativity in healing. They're doing these very sophisticated studies around what happens to neural systems in the healing process as they get into creative flow, et cetera. So I think those kinds of interests are beginning to spill into, or at their best, I think, are beginning to spill into questions about what makes for healthy places, right? So when I learned, so some of the Johns Hopkins work that I know is happening is related to neuroaesthetics and understanding your physical responses to aesthetics and being in creative flow. And some of that is connected to also the work that as I said, that NEA is doing with the Department of Defense. I think that there is so much to learn from that and potentially apply to how we think about cultivating healthy and just communities. So I think there's a bridge. There's a bridge that is being built. There's a bridge that's emerging, let's say, between the kinds of scientific studies that have to do with the benefits of involvement in the arts, both from a consumption vantage point as well as from a creative process vantage point. There are things to be learned in that context that I think apply as we continue to reimagine how we want to build healthy communities where people can thrive.
So it seems like the glue to the bridge is reimagining, having imagination, being flexible. It's about, accepting varied views and perspectives. What strategies do you have for the professionals in the room today who really are hearing you in this conversation and they're ready to move to the next level? What resources do you have for those who may be in environments that are discouraging? What strategies and things do they have that they can hold on to as they try to reimagine and reinvigorate their own imagination?
Yeah, I think that there are artists, architects, designers that are moving beyond. They're working out of their lane, let's say, in the best way. They're moving into territory that is not usual in the profession. So yes, artists, working in, there's colleagues at Arizona State University that are working in municipal government and are helping municipal governments create the environment that would be more conducive to that kind of contribution from an artist, right? So there's that kind of work. There are architects that are reimagining what it is to what it means to create homes that are culturally appropriate. So there's work that is happening around the country in spots, right? And I think connecting to those is really important. And I know we're close to out of time, but it's something, it would be really wonderful to figure out how to connect people who want to do that work with folks who are in that line, right? That are already advancing that. And sharing practices, and I don't say just best practices because you learn from failure. So it doesn't sound right to say share failure, but actually that's where you learn the most. So in addition to best practices, I think to have the opportunity to learn about where people have tried things and haven't been successful is also really, really important. And I think that there are networks that are emerging to do that. And there's people that have been at this for a long time, but they've been always kind of niche and at the margins. It hasn't, again, it's not in the water yet, but it should be.
Maria, I do want to ask a question here because you've talked so much about spirit, and I deeply appreciate that. And as a professor, and I'm sure you may have the same experience, I love the university spaces and being in classroom with students because you see that creative energy, you see this kind of spirit that exists in those spaces. And what I've always wondered, that after you leave the classroom with all of the creative energy that happens in the classroom and in those conversations, and then you go out in the so-called real world, people tend to become, beat up and jaded in that space. So anyone who's asking about students, how do you keep students kind of really engaged, even as they leave the classroom space and go out? And so Lakiva, I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly here. If not, please forgive me for that. But she has asked a question related to that. And it says, and she said here, what are your recommendations for students who are taught the varied worldviews and perspectives of acceptance, but go into environments that discourage that thinking and mindset? And I think that question is so on point, especially with us.
It is.
Yeah.
It's such an important question, and I wish we had more time for it. Let me just make a quick response. I have often had students who get excited, and it's wonderful to see, right? They get turned on and motivated to be change makers, to go out and actually do and act on the ideas and values that they're learning and creating also on their own. And the question often comes to me, which is, how can I get a job doing this? And the response, and hopefully it will change over time, and I think it has a little bit. My response has often been, you're going to have to make one up, or you're going to have to reinterpret one. And I, some of the best advice that I got when I was early in my career was from a dear mentor who was really clear about figuring out what your work is as a person, not what your job is, not what your title is, but what you're supposed to be doing as a person. What is your contribution to the world? And then I talk about, even now, the way I've constructed my career is to work from different perches, right? The work is in service of the same idea, but to do it from higher ed, or to do it from government, or from philanthropy, or from the nonprofit sector, or from, these different places that have the potential to be influential and create a swell, a strategic swell. That is important. But it requires thinking about your role differently. It's not about the job with the job description that is presented to you. It is about your opportunity to do your work in that perch, or from that perch, let's say. And that's something that in higher ed, I am trying to figure out, how do you teach that? Because it's a different take on entrepreneurialism, right? It's not entrepreneurialism in the way that we all always think about it in terms of maybe a business school or that kind of thing. But there is something about being strategic and entrepreneurial and purpose-driven that leads us to potentially reimagine what our work opportunities are. But often my advice has been, you're going to have to make up that job, or you're going to have to reinterpret it. And I hope that at some point that doesn't have to be my answer.
All right.
Well, it's interesting because as an entrepreneur, it feels exact and right, that as a person who has a problem that they want to solve, that marketing, that's just like brand and positioning. Am I going to be positioned in the nonprofit sector? I'm going to be positioned in the government sector. Then what problem am I solving? So I think that was beautiful. I see Katie's on, which means we're out of time.
Yeah.
So nice to hear from you. And thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah. And thank you, Maria. Thank you for allowing us to be in conversation with you, and deep appreciation for your work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you all. What an amazing discussion we've had this morning. I'm going to be rewatching this video a couple of times because there's so many rich conversation that's happened. It's got me rethinking kind of the role of an arts council and how we can be a bridge between other sectors, particularly with the local government. So thank you. I really appreciate it. So I have a few announcements in closing, so I'll let you guys step off the stage. And welcome Ed back.
And I just want to join in and also say thank you so much to all three of you. Just a fabulous job, and Katie, right on, a very rich discussion with so much in there that it'll be great to go back and look at that recap.
So we have our final event in the Winter Buzz Breakfast coming up next month on April 15th. This will be a local panel. We'll have Steph Monsendahl from the city of Asheville, Sekou Coleman from Asheville Writers in the Schools and Community, Cortina Caldwell from the Ade Project, and myself will also be on the panel, and that will be moderated again by Darin and Aisha. It should be a really good conversation. So if you're not already registered, please go to leadershipasheville.unca.edu and get registered.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. We're looking forward to that because we've had these great conversations from nationally recognized speakers. And now we want to bring that conversation to our community and really focus in on what we can do to continually create an equitable place. So really looking forward to next month. So please sign up and join us then. Just want to say again, thank you to the Van Winkle Law Firm for sponsoring us and for being the presenting sponsor, but also Explore Asheville and the North Carolina Arts Council who've contributed, all of our table sponsors and our featured sponsors who have banners. We're going to go back into conversation mode so you guys can still meet and talk with each other and chat and maybe say hello to some friends you haven't seen in a while. You'll have some time to do that. But also go check out our, click on some of the sponsor banners. They've got some really cute videos and things in there that they've taken time to put in. So really want to say thank you so much. And Katie, thank you again. This has been really a powerful conversation for us to have. So we appreciate it.
Thank you, Ed.
Yeah. All right, folks, have fun and we'll see you at the tables.